We'll continue talking about bolted connections, and here I want to talk quickly about the ways a bolted connection can fail, two styles of bolted connections that you'll read about in steel construction manuals, and then I want to end with a short look at a skywalk disaster that was caused by a bolted connection. There are 5 ways that a bolted connection could fail. It could fail by the bolt shearing, and you know that if you have a bolted connection in double shear, it's going to be twice as strong, twice as able to resist shearing out as a single shear would be. Bearing failure is where the side of the steel piece and the bolt bear directly on each other. So that was kind of like compression. Tension can cause the piece of steel actually to pull apart. Related to that is end tear out. If the bolt hole is too close to the edge of the piece of steel, it can shear out with the bolt just ripping right through that hole. And then a combination of shear and tension and end failure is this block shear, where it just rips all the way along the end of the beam. Turns out, as you might imagine, that edge distance is really important to keep bolts and bolt holes from ripping out. And AISC says that at a minimum, the edge distance should be 1.5 times the hole diameter. So let me back up here. So for example, if you had 1/2-inch bolts here, it should be at least 3/4 of an inch from the center of the hole to the edge. 1.5 times 3/4. 1.5 times 1/2 is 3/4. If this were a structural steel connection, you'd be using 3/4-inch bolts. 1.5 times 3/4 is 1 1/8. So in a structural steel connection, it should be at least 1 1/8 from the center of the hole to the edge of the steel. And you can use this guideline in other kinds of situations besides structural steel. There are 2 categories of bolted connection. If you want to dig into the bolted connection world, you'll read about these. One of them is slip critical, and it depends on friction. In slip critical, this bolt and nut are tightened so tightly that they clamp together these 2 pieces, and the bolt never sits down on the surface of the hole. In a bearing connection, the bolt does sit down on the edge of the hole. Finally, the Hyatt Regency Skywalk. This was a new hotel in Kansas City, Missouri. They had a grand opening in 1981, and this was one of those, it was a new style at the time, having a big open atrium in the middle of the hotel and then skywalks going around the outside and through the middle, connecting the floors. Engineers have since learned how to build these better, but at the time this was a new idea. So here's a schematic, sort of a pictorial drawing of what this looked like. And at this grand opening, there was music and there were lots of people, and they were out here on the skywalk celebrating this atrium, dancing and jumping up and down on these skywalks. And the people on the 4th floor, there were quite a few people, they were jumping up and down. This 4th floor skywalk collapsed and came down and pancaked. It hit flat on the 2nd floor walkway and it collapsed. and so 114 people died. What happened? In this skywalk, the beams were made out of 2 channel irons welded together, and it turned out that was fine. The welds did rip out, but it wasn't because these were channel irons. It was because in the original design, there was a threaded rod that went all the way from the ground floor up through the 4th floor and into the roof. One single threaded rod. And at the steel fabricator's shop, a drafter looked at that design and realized that's expensive to have a threaded rod that long. We can save money by using shorter threaded rods. We'll have one for one floor connection. We'll have a separate one for a separate floor connection, and we'll put them side to side like this. It seemed like a reasonable idea. And so the fabricator went ahead and replaced the single threaded rod with shorter rods 1 story at a time. And the problem is the engineer who was responsible for the project did not check the drawing again after this change was made. I think that engineer lost his license for failing to check the drawing. So yeah, it was the drafter's idea. It was the engineer's fault for not doing checks and calculations. What happened was, by doing the rods 1 level at a time, the amount of force on each nut at the end of the rod doubled and tripled with each floor going upward, and the threads on the end of this rod could not hold 3 times the original force, and they just pulled through. So that's an example of how you might think something looks like a practical idea, and until you actually get in there and do some calculations, you don't know for sure that it's going to work. I think my other point here is that as a drafter, you are not expected to do calculations. That is not your job. That is the engineer's job. And you can have a good design idea. That's good. But the engineer who's in charge is always responsible for making the calculations and stamping the drawing with their red stamp. So, and the other thing I want to say is, if your boss says, I'd like you to do some calculations on this structure here, your answer should be no. No, I am not qualified. I do not have a red stamp. That is the engineer's job. So there you go.